Adventuring Party for the third week of October 2022. This week, the party once again tackles the chaotic freedom of the OSR and the unshakable rigid principles behind it. Have certain things maybe been overstated? Listen to find out. The Adventuring Party, discussing tabletop and native gaming the Irish way.
Welcome to the party. I'm Dave.
And I'm Shane, and I hate everything that is old and worship the new like a god. Or at least that's what all of my critics say.
Look, your rampant philia for the new is well known, my man.
I feel like it's a slightly exaggerated. Folks, I've previously been accused of, my genocidal crusade against the OSR and all it stands for. I prefer to think of it as coming from a place of respect. Not quite love, but definitely of this OSR thing, this old school revival, to give its full title, this attempt to bring back older ways of role-playing and put them in front of the new audience. I think it's a noble gesture. I just think there's a undercurrent of making things up and pretending. I just feel like it needs to be tested a little bit more.
All right.
That's sort of my take on the OSR as a developing thing. And to that end, we've pulled out something that purports, perhaps a little presumptuously, to be the foundational document of the OSR, or some form of attempt, a bit of a Nicene Creed of the OSR, maybe is a better analogy.
Yeah, foundational document implies early, and this is relatively new.
Yeah, this is, I believe, 2015? Yes. This is called the Principia Apocrypha. Elementary axioms and aphorisms on running tabletop RPGs in the old school style.
Sounds suitably, textbook-like.
Yeah. I feel like it's a 2015 or so document. And as we said, the OSR really gets its start somewhere around 2007. I think that's when the original Castles and Crusades came out. That's the period. But I was saying, this was not, there when the OSR started growing. This is very much a collation of years of thought when the OSR was transferring to the mainstream. It's designed by a few of the big names in OSR thought-making as well. The primary author is Ben Milton, possibly the most famous OSR YouTuber.
I think that's a fair assessment.
He's known online as The Questing Beast. He has a blog, he has a YouTube channel, and he actually has made several games, including Maze Rats and Knave.
Fairly lightweight in rules, even as OSR goes, and no bad thing in itself.
Yeah. There's a few other names here. Stephen Lumpkin, who is the Roll D100 blog, and David Perry, who has a blog called Lityscape, although there's an extra H in there. Searching for the Principia Apocrypha get you all these names. We'll try to put a link in the show notes. But yeah, so they have put together this document which basically brings out the primary thought principles behind the OSR game design. And just looking at the introduction to this document, the way they frame this is that we are rediscovering the context of old school gaming. And I immediately start poking at that because rediscovery implies that all of this years of blog-fueled and Google Plus driven theory crafting on what the OSR is, that didn't really exist until fairly recently. There's certainly, as we've seen from our episodes on the Tomo Gygax, which you should take a look at. It's a trip.
You really should.
It's wonderful, and it does indeed have hidden inside its text sort of the assumptions which would create what we would call old school play. But I wouldn't say that rediscovering is quite the term I would use. I feel like an awful lot of the archaeology of old game design and the assumptions behind it is partly finding out how people played back in the day, but also a lot of the philosophy of it is a very modern thing. I don't think Gygax had these kind of sound bites of what is old school play in his head. I think it's just he had a whole bunch of unexamined assumptions on play, and he applied those to his games and his game design.
Yeah, I mean, just on Gygax and his assumption, like Gary Gygax clearly came up with some very interesting stuff. He also had very specific ideas about how games should be run and how campaigns should be, and unexamined assumptions, I think, is if anything, putting it lightly.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not denigrating the all the work that's been done by people over the years, sort of interviewing all original gamers, talking about how they played their games, and sort of reconstructing the context. That's all been very useful, as I say, it's sort of game archaeology. But I do think that what we call OSR today, there's definitely certain substreets of it which is very modern and minimalist compared to what you see in the AD&D book, where you're tracking monthly diseases and counting out your copper coins. But we could look through more of this document. The next thing is it's attempted an overall definition of old school play. This is page 4 of the document? 5. It has a characteristic here, quote from Ben Milton. The more of the following a campaign has, the more old school it is. High lethality, an open world, a lack of pre-written plot, emphasis on creative problem solving, an exploration-centered reward system, usually XP for treasure, a disregard for encounter balance, and the use of random tables to generate world elements that surprise both players and referees. Also, a strong do-it-yourself attitude and a willingness to share your work and use the creativity of others in your game. What do you think? Make of that as your definition?
Like at a glance, it doesn't seem objectionable. It sounds like it fits fairly well with the actual old school of Gary Gygax and the like. Judging by yourself and Savage's examination of the ancient texts. It sounds like you disagree with that.
It's not so much disagree as the way that the definition sort of has to be written is not quite a level of bullet points, but it does seem to be in a list format. And the idea being that there's degrees of old school. And I do find that interesting as a definition because it implies it's like submarine depth. You sort of choose how deep you want to go. But what it also really interests me is the element of, I overuse the term dichotomy a lot, but there's the do it yourself, share your work online, and then use stuff that other people have put online in your game, which sounds a bit contradictory, but when you realize just how much of the OSR was sort of built on blogs and Google Plus posting, it makes sense from a perspective of the OSR community, if you would. Yeah,
honestly, though, I don't think it's that much of a dichotomy, if any at all, because if you look at DIY aesthetics, and in a bunch of contexts, people happily draw on each other's work. The idea of a solo artist who creates from nothing, it's a myth. Everyone draws on influences and inspiration from elsewhere. I think, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, I think what they're getting at is that this is a more open process, as in, yes, we are drawing on each other's bursts of creativity and ideas, and we're embracing that.
I guess that's fair. It's just it's a very interesting. That's being presented as a core part of the OSR experience is the feedback loop between your game and everyone else's game. It's simultaneously saying that you need to put in your own work, but also trying to extend an olive branch of connecting with everyone else. Which you could look at as a bit self-serving because, as I say, traffic drives blogs and YouTube channels. At the same time, it's kind of charming as, say, please join our clubhouse.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there are very few absolutes in this world, and somebody can simultaneously have a true love of this style of gaming and also a desire to, well, to get more exposure for purposes of personal gratification, recognition, or, even financial. Although, honestly, OSR doesn't seem to be a great way to go if you want to get rich.
Yeah.
RPGs in general.
Some people manage to make a living out of it, or at least in theory. Yeah, it's the kind of thing where you have to give your money away for free for years before you get a customer base enough to support you. An interesting artifact of the current publishing industry. But yeah, we come down next to what they call sort of primary, cardinal principle. And that's the very simple concept that your table is yours. That ultimately, it's up to you to decide, are you going to use this rule or this piece of advice or this system? The ultimate responsibility lies on you, which is probably the right way to have it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I heard similar sentiments being called like a rule zero. Ultimately, no book can fix your game for you. It's your game. You have to run it.
Yeah, no, I think that's an entirely fair proposal, and honestly, one that if whether it applies outside of OSR or not, probably should. The idea that you can't, that the GM and players between them do not have complete control over the game they're in, is a strange one to me. I mean, where the balance between GM and players lies exactly, that is an entirely other question, but no, I think that's an entirely fair assertion, particularly for old school gaming, where there's less of an emphasis on dictate via rulebook.
But now we're getting into the meat of it as we get to our sort of chapter 1. This one is called Be an Impartial Arbiter. And this is very much directly put at the GM. And it's the advice to be impartial, arbitrate the rules, and figure out the decisions that the players are making in that context. I find it interesting that the very first bullet point in this category is rulings over rules, which I find the term rulings to be inherently non-impartial, because it is... This is one of those things that I wonder when I have, big, strong feelings about these things. I feel like my definition of rulings is different from the one that these OSR people are so proud of, because to my mind, a ruling is very much a GM intervention. The GM has to step in, brush aside the existing rules and say, no, this is what we have to say. And that, to put that in the chapter about being impartial, that immediately strikes me as odd.
Does. The text underneath helps provide some context in that they're emphasizing that OSR games tend to be more rules light. So there are more gaps. And even a GM who even intends to go by the rules is going to run into problems of the rules don't say anything about this situation or this interaction. And the reading I'm getting from it is, at some point, even an impartial arbiter is going to have to make a call just to have the game function. They're going to have to decide what this gap, how this gap has to be addressed.
I understand that. So OSR games tend to be rules light because they want to have, they term it openness. It's an open system that the players can insert any amount of creativity into. And that means that, rather than be restrictive with their rules, they rely on rulings from the GM to keep the game running. My thought about this is I consider rulings over rules to be GMing advice, not game design advice, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's fair. I would about the main way it would apply to design advice is, well, you can't account for everything, or at least definitely you aren't going to be accounting for everything if you want to keep your rules light. Now, this is a bigger priority for some game designers than others. And there is the school of thought, again, within the broader OSR sphere, that house rules are just game rules that haven't been codified yet. As in, any number of OSR games, if you look at their history, ultimately start as somebody's house rules of a different game.
That's true.
Yeah, and honestly, I've seen the pretty convincing argument that if you want any length of a campaign, a rules light system, it simply is going to accumulate a huge number of, well, rulings that ultimately should have been game rules to begin with, and you might have saved yourself some time and effort by starting with a more robust system.
Yeah, it's I always say dichotomy, but it's this feel of I think when this first came up, I do think that fellow party member Owen said best is that if you are continually having to make the same ruling again and again, then that's a rule that should have already been in the rulebook. And the OSR is based on the idea that it's your table. We can't presume that your table is going to need the same things as every other table, but I don't think there's anything wrong with presuming that, someone running your OSR game probably needs dungeon crawling rules and rules for elaborate rope and pulley systems, and you gotta think, it's just if something's going to come up again and again, having a rule for that is not evil, I guess. But at the same time, as pure GM device, the concept of just make a ruling and move on rather than spending 20 minutes in the rulebook.
We've all been there.
Yeah. I don't think that's inherently bad. It is, again, it's just the oddness of calling this as part of the impartiality thing. I just find the concept of making a ruling being impartial to be quite odd. But the next one is possibly more about this, which is to divest yourself of their fate. This is to say that GM should not be trying out to save the players in an old school game, but also should not be necessarily trying to destroy them either. You're not supposed to be either pro or anti the group. You're supposed to be, the impartial arbiter who's running the world.
Honestly, just from an editing point of view, I could see an argument for putting this section at the very least above rulings over rules, because it fits more with the impartial arbiter bit.
Yeah.
Whereas rulings over rules might arguably be more useful to a GM. I think you have a very good point in that it's more GM advice. As opposed to game design advice.
Yeah, but divesting yourself of fate, that's one of those things I think is good abstract advice, but it can be difficult to apply because we are, emotional creatures. GM bias, that's going to come in, and presumably the GM was open about that, and they're going to like some ideas more than others, and, having to keep this in mind to say, you shouldn't be interfering when they do things you like, and you shouldn't be pushing back if they're doing things you're not as fond of, and you shouldn't be putting your hands on the scales the other way. That's good advice in this context, but it's difficult to do. Again, possibly another reason to put this higher up on the list as important thing. But it's also, I immediately swip this around and go to the player perspective. It's just how could you say that the GM isn't responsible for my fate? The GM is the one who put these pit traps all along this cord. The GM is the one who said that behind the 3 goblins there was, a 3-headed troll.
Yeah, I see that point. I suppose, I think where this is coming from is the notion of the GM is setting up the starting conditions and is role-playing how the different factions or individuals in the world that aren't PCs act. And in this old school ethos, isn't trying to dictate a story or trying to railroad players along a railroad of predetermined plot. The players have the ability to choose their fate, at least in theory. That doesn't mean they're going to win all the time. That means they get choices, meaningful choices about what their characters are going to try.
Yeah, and again, that in the ideal situation, that is really commendable. Again, something that maybe even outside of OSR situations you should think about a little. But it's still the GM's responsibility to apply the consequences of actions. It is still the GM who solves the player's solutions to things. You're sort of on a tightrope with this, because it is you who say, oh, you find 50,000 gold pieces, and it's you who says the three-headed troll bites all your heads off. You can try divesting yourself of the fate by leaving it up to player actions and dice, but it's still, at the same time, it's going to be you pulling the trigger at the end. And depending on the emotional context of your gaming table, you might not just be able to wash your hands completely of it. Maybe the players will be happy with it, but you might still feel terrible about it. That's something, this is advice. Divest yourself of their fate is advice. It's not necessarily so easy to follow.
Yeah, no, I think you raised some very valid points there. I suspect that the idea isn't to somehow be entirely fair at all times or entirely partial at all times, but making the effort as well. It's a lot better than you win this fight, or rocks fall, everyone dies because I'm feeling irked. That's to use the other extreme.
Yeah, that's fair. Next up is leaving preparation flexible, and I've sort of conflated this with the point after, which is to build responsive situations. So the idea here is how you handle your prep, and this is rather than having sort of tight prep, you prep a little bit more looser, more flexible, so that not only are you going to be able to add or subtract things on the fly depending on how the players approach a situation, but your situation is meant to be entirely responsive to what happens. It's like the situation won't just go, oh, there's some people setting fire to the nearby orphanage, that's weird. Something will happen as a result of player action. And I think this is good advice. Just in general for every type of game is the thing.
It's hard to really disagree with that. I mean, some of the most frustrating situations I've been in as a player in RPGs was when it's very clear that my character's actions will have no effect, like not even theoretically, on the outcome of matters. And it raised the question, what am I doing there? Because if I want to experience somebody else's story with no interaction, there's books and films and computer games. So I suppose that inspired quite a strong reaction towards in my attitude towards railroading and predetermined plots and what have you.
Well, yeah, I do think there's certain parts of this set of principles that are sort of universal advice that I don't know if it's perfectly fine to emphasize them as in an OSR context, but I don't think they should necessarily claim them as being just OSR. I think this is advice in general. You should always have some leeway in your prep because you don't know how your players are going to react to a situation. But also, the situation should be able to respond to what the players do. It shouldn't be this monolithic brick that only has one output. It should be able to respond to what the players do and, adjust on the fly to a certain extent. Obviously, you don't want to have a malleable mush that can, change on a whim and there's no real sense of reality. But yeah, responsiveness, I think, is a very good way of putting it. And I would suggest putting that idea into all your games, not just your OSR throwback campaigns.
Agreed.
The next two are another sort of pair, which is to embrace chaos but uphold logic.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. As in, don't be tied to predetermined notions. Again, a corollary of don't be railroading. Yeah, that's something of a bugbear for me. So we all bring our perspectives to read these things, but logic. A game world has an internal logic, or at least should do. Even if a world is fantastical or very strange, there should be some inherent way it works. because otherwise all is random and you know decisions mean nothing, because an entirely random world, it doesn't matter what a PC does.
This is, I think, possibly the more OSR specific version of what we had above with, the responsive situations, because this is sort of where the OSR lives and dies, is in having weirdness that has an internal logic, but also having the random tables. This is something they bring up here, is that you should have random tables to hand to add into a game, whether it be encounters or weird NPCs, or this is what's around this corner, or this is what happens if you eat this mushroom. But also there's the thing is like, a dice roll, as a skill check is not something you ignore, but a dice roll on a random table for inspiration, you're not beholden to that. That's just, I need an idea, and that doesn't mean you're committing the same way. You're not fudging dice if you roll Killer Clowns from Outer Space on your random encounter table and say, no, that's not what I want for my game.
Yeah.
It's not dice fudging, it's just your inspiration, your muse went a little too far. You should still have, be open to some weird outcomes, but not ones that completely undermine the logic of your game.
Yeah, the random tables can be wonderful for combining ideas and creating inspiration which you wouldn't necessarily have thought of yourself, because again, the ethos of the earlier cardinal principle, you can draw on the creativity of others, and that's great. And you can draw on combinations they didn't foresee either. As in, even the creators of tables aren't going to immediately think of, oh, if you did this result and this result and combined them, you would have X. But another GM might look at it and go, that's why. That's definitely why.
Yeah, and there's a sort of an element of the OSR likes that idea that one table has X, one table has Y. This is like, that means that our random tables and interpretations can go in multiple directions. That's creative, that's good. And it means it's more personal to your table, which that's generally considered something important. Like, the OSR purports that a unified, every table is on the same iteration of the Forgotten Realms. They reject that. They say, no, every table is unique. We are providing these rules and these random tables as inspiration for you, but your table should be unique to you. Which is an interesting thought. Like, when we live in a world where D&D and D&D-like thought is so ubiquitous, so mainstream, there's going to be Legos of D&D now.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's an interesting, different attitude to say that, no, we can have a shared play culture like the OSR, but that doesn't mean that every table is the same. It means the opposite. It means every game is wildly unique in its own way. The chapter does leave off with another piece of what I would consider more universal advice, which is to let them off the rail. I think at this point that's universal advice. It's something like railroading at this point is more like a symptom of GM thought rather than, a given system.
It can be encouraged by certain systems, but yes, it is more of a GM quirk, let's just say. But yeah, I would go further than them in saying let them off the rails. But you know what? That's my personal bias.
Yeah, the way they place it here is that you should tell them, oh, I've prepped this dungeon and this random village, and if you want to go to 57 miles the other direction, I guess I'll have to pull out all these random tables and see what random encounters are on the road. Please note that this is not balanced for your level.
That is an approach. It does seem a little passive-aggressive for my taste.
Maybe. Yeah, but the point is that you don't constrain people and you don't force them down different routes. You figure out if they want to, get around this random ogre you rolled your tables. Let them figure out a plan. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, okay. No, that's fair enough.
But yeah, I do think having no rails is sort of general advice. Yeah. There are contexts where a player does want a railroad as a guidance, but I don't think that is universally a go-to system. I think in general, all games should be letting people off the rails.
Oh yeah, like adventure books and setting books, they're inspirational material. They're not, as far as I'm concerned, not hard and fast anything.
So we've gone through the first chapter of the Principia Apocrypha. Let us know in our Discord, or by emailing us, or leaving a comment on our YouTube, or otherwise. Do you want to hear more of us railing against the straight jacket of all these pretentious bloggers? Or if you would prefer us to ease off on them and glorify their enlightened principles from on high. All our social media are available. Twitter, YouTube, Discord. Links to all these should be in the show notes. But for now,
this party is over.
Thanks for listening to The Adventuring Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account at AdventuringPTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, link in the show notes. The Adventuring Party is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike version 3 license.